Welcome everybody. We are so happy that you are able to join us today to the Smart Families monthly webinar, which is Turn Around, Don't Drown. My name is Sally. I am the Programme Director for Smart Families and I host these webinars. And this month we've been focusing on technology and nature and what is it that we are noticing about what's happening with our youth and our students and our children. And some practical ways that we can implement some really positive changes to help our children engage more in nature. We are joined by a very special guest today. I have Sarah, who's joining us from SG Wellness. Sarah is coming on, and her and I will be having a conversation shortly about the interaction between technology and nature. And then she's got a wonderful presentation that she's going to show. And I will let Sarah introduce herself in a minute. But she's going to share with us some slides, really as an expert in this field, as someone who has lots to share about her wealth and all her knowledge to do with nature. So welcome, Sarah. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Yes. Before you introduce yourself, Sarah, I'm just going to do a very brief overview of our newsletter that we released this month. Just if anybody who's on our webinar wasn't able to see our newsletter, this was something that we focused on specifically around technology, some of the interactions from a sensory perspective. What is it that we're seeing in changes for students in classrooms? And then also we talked a little bit about the science of awe and wonder, and that part I'm going to leave to Sarah because she is going to be talking through that in her presentation. So for those of you who don't know me and haven't joined us on a webinar before, I was a teacher in the classroom for 16 years prior to coming to work for Smart Families. And so I myself had been noticing some really interesting shifts in my students over the years. And it wasn't necessarily just after COVID. There were some things going on before COVID, and definitely COVID came along and was this perfect storm. And the way that we were all thrust onto technology for such a large portion of our kind of existence really did have some impacts. And so I would notice that for some of my children, they would do really interesting things like, and I was an elementary teacher, falling off their chairs for no reason. And I had started to notice this and had started to note and recognize that this was something that I would see more frequently. And so I spoke to my other teacher friends and I said the same thing to them, like, I'm noticing my students, and they were like, oh, my students are doing the same thing. So I started to research and I realized this was not an isolated thing that was happening in my classroom. Other teachers were talking about their students also falling off chairs. I was also having a great rise in students who were finding it really hard to track from the board where I was teaching and write things down on paper. You know, I had increasingly fidgety students. And I know in this day and age, sometimes people and parents may look to, you know, explore, are there any reasons behind this? But I really, truly felt like technology and the way my students were using technology more was starting to have an effect on some of the things that I was seeing in the classroom, almost like the symptoms. So one of the things I was going to, and we put this into our newsletter this month, was really how children were not being able to access free play and they were not going outside as often. And whereas when I first became a teacher, my students would go home and they were outside. And this was really the dawn of iPads. Like, this is pre-iPad. They were going out and they were playing outside, you know, in the front gardens, in the back gardens, or the front yards and the backyards, if I use my American language. Whereas what children were doing more when I was kind of exploring with my families and saying, hey, you know, what happens when you go home? And very often, you know, very tired parents, we have very busy lives. And sometimes it was just an option that a child would sit on an iPad. And so this was like two components. There was this limited free play and then just not being outdoors. And it was really the interaction and the intersection of those two things that I had a huge amount of interest in. I want to just share my screen and I want to show you a video that was really impactful when I was doing my research when I was creating the newsletter. This was from a company in the UK called Purcell. They did their own research into what is happening with children and play. And so I'm going to share my screen. And I forgot to say, if anybody does have any questions, please, you can use the chat. If you don't want to use the chat, you can just raise your hand or just interrupt. You know, I always say the teacher in me loves interaction and conversation. So please feel free to share anything. Okay, so I'm going to share my window, and I would love if somebody could just confirm that you can see my screen and hear when it starts. So can you, Dean or Hillary?
I can see it. Yep.
Perfect. Okay, I'm going to play. If anyone can't hear it, please let me know and I can change my settings. But I think I've set it so that we should be able to hear. Okay. Oh, can you hear that? Oh.
I didn't know what freedom was until it was taken from me. It's
Sally, maybe make it a little bit louder if possible for the video.
Stripped away. You can never escape the walls. You can never escape your mind. Then imagine they open your door. You have time to walk out that door and feel the sun on your face. It's everything to me.
My daily outdoors time. I think that's probably the most important part of my day.
Take all the frustrations and all your problems and just leave them out there.
Keeps my mind right, keeps my body strong. It's pretty much the highlight of my day.
So, how would you feel if your yard time was reduced to just 1 hour a day?
Yeah. What am I supposed to tell you how I feel about that?
I'm gonna feel pretty sad about it.
I think that's gonna build more anger, it's not gonna be a good thing.
Would be torture.
I think cutting the offender's outside time to an hour a day is potentially disastrous.
Well, do you know who does have only 1 hour outdoors per day? Children.
Wow.
That's depressing.
I don't even know what to say to that.
Something has gone very wrong.
Even as I sit in here and as a prisoner, I mean, yeah, that's not good.
If you don't have to throw the kids in the bathtub, they haven't played hard enough.
Climb a tree, break a leg. You know, that's part of life.
Learn to be a kid.
So, if you could have one wish, what would it be?
I wish I could take my kid to a park today.
Okay, so I think you can see how impactful that video was when I saw that video. Can I just confirm? I think I've stopped sharing my screen and I can see people. Yeah, wonderful. And it really hit home at when we really look at how much time children are spending outdoors. It's really quite scary when you put it into perspective like that. And even seeing the prisoners, and these are high security prisoners, sharing that they're shocked that children don't even go outside as much. So my research then led me into, well, what are the implications of these children not being outside and not being outdoors as much? And one of the things that I learned from some researchers who've been studying child development is an impact on something called the vestibular system. And I've kind of outlined this in the newsletter, but I will briefly go over that now. And when I read this as a teacher, I was like, this is what I am seeing with my students in my classroom. So often we know about the 5 different senses, and we have, hearing and sight and touch. Well, there's another sensory system called the vestibular system, which isn't really as well known. but it's extremely important when it comes to child development. And the vestibular system is a part in the brain that gets developed through things like motion, and it helps with our balance. And so the way that you grow this vestibular system is through doing big movements. So things like swinging, rolling. So you can imagine a young child like swinging on a swing, rolling down a hill, spinning. And what actually happens when a child is using a screen, the brain isn't able to process such fast, colorful, stimulating images and keep the vestibular system online in the same way. And so what the brain has to do to compensate is it will switch off, in effect, the vestibular system so that a child can process an image, fast-moving image on a screen. Now, what parents might recognize with this is that when then it comes to maybe a parent says, right, that's it, you've had enough time on your iPad, and they take the iPad away, that vestibular system comes online extremely quickly. And it's almost like a little bit of a misfiring in the brain. Something that's been switched off is now firing back up. And that can look like a pretty significant tantrum. And that's where parents see the screaming. And so neurologically, there's a change going on inside that child's brain. So what does that mean? Well, if the vestibular system isn't developing and isn't growing and maturing like it should, then we have underdeveloped vestibular systems. And what this can actually look like, and maybe a phrase that some of you may have heard, is sensory deficit. And I know that I have had students in my class who've presented with sensory deficit, and it means that you have to compensate for that sensory input that that child has not had. What can that look like in the classroom? Children falling off chairs because they are not able to balance themselves and find their place in the world, and their balance in their brain is not developed enough. It can also look like fidgety students. It can also look like children who can't track from the board to the page. It also has big implications on handwriting. So the vestibular system is huge, and it really is starting to become more well known. And I was actually at a conference recently, and there was a lady that presented on this, and she said every teacher needs to know about the vestibular system, because the more children are using technology and the more they're spending time on screens, stationary, looking at a screen. We also have a huge surge in children who are now wearing glasses and need help with glasses because they are looking at a screen and they're not developing all of the parts of the eye in the same way. But definitely with things about how they determine perspective and being able to find their place in the world is the vestibular system. And so I have written more of this in the newsletter, but it was just a really fascinating thing for me to learn about. That what does it we do hear people say the children aren't being outdoors as much, they're not playing as much. So it was really interesting for me to find out what that actually means in regards to child development and neurological development. So I could talk about this all day. This is like one of my favorite things to share with people. And it was just very enlightening to learn that, gosh, yes, there are all these amazing things about being out in nature, but when that's translating into the classroom or into the home as these challenges, I mean, I think we're able to see a much bigger picture. We kind of like zoom out and we're able to see. So I just wanted to start by sharing that. Please look at our newsletter if you are interested in reading more about this. We've done a section on sensory deficit, and I also have got references in there that you can look at. So I just want to now pivot over to our wonderful guest. Sarah, do you just want to maybe briefly introduce yourself, and could you maybe share with us why it's so important for us to be having this conversation now when it's with regards to children and nature?
Yeah, of course. Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm so pleased to be here with y'all today. So as Sally mentioned, my name is Sarah Nielsen. I am a health and outdoor educator. I am based in Austin, Texas, and that's where I have my private practice. And so I've actually been working in health and outdoor education for the past 18 years and in different populations as time has gone on. And so now where I'm working now is the intersection of course, children, but adults and seniors as well when it comes to our relationships with screens and nature. And the phrase that I'm going to say early and often is, let's get more green time, less screen time. And that's something that resonates with all age groups, all abilities. And I think that we're, as Sally said, we're kind of coming at this point where we're starting to realize that in the past 40 years or so, we've really seen a saturation of screens in our lives. We've seen a huge increase in what's just known as like indoor-based screen entertainment versus outside stuff. And so the more comfortable we get with that, that becomes our comfort zone. And then outdoors becomes unknown, dirty, scary. And then the tides the scales kind of start to balance more towards comfort, towards screens than the unknown in nature. And then too, Sally, I can't remember if you talked about this, but just also like we've had screens for so long. We do something called what I call the screen shuffle, which is we tend to take breaks from screens with other screens. So we'll go from the phone to the laptop to the TV, sometimes all three at once. And what that is also doing to our attention spans, children's attention spans, that's a really big conversation right now as well, especially with smartphones and TikTok and just everything, social media. But then with a reduced attention span, nature is now boring. And so we have to work almost a little bit harder to make it appealing, to make it welcoming and open for people that have not had a lot of outdoor experiences yet. And they may be dealing with a little bit of what's called biophobia, which is a fear or a dislike of nature. And we'll get into that a little bit more. But yeah, that's the opening statement for our conversation today.
And Sarah and I, we have been in conversation for many months now, because as you know, I was kind of doing my research and I discovered Sarah. We've had lots of conversations, even from within the classroom. I would, like, touching on what Sarah just said, I would see children who were very adverse to like getting sticky fingers, or like, you know, they didn't want to have glitter on them, and they would be like, ugh. And I, you know, whereas in the early days, I mean, the messier the better. And I would see these children who loved like painting their hands with wet glue and peeling it off, and you know, all the things that I've always seen in the classroom with young students, to now a shift where it was kind of like, you know, uncomfortable for them to be messy or be dirty. And again, a lot of the remnants of that have come from, you know, I saw a lot of children who were, you know, just had been observing the world kind of through COVID, and that it almost got misconstrued that like being dirty or being in the sand was dangerous. You know, like we can't do this. We can't let the children. And so it's how do we kind of shift back like gradually and really introduce nature. And I love what you just said about sometimes when children, I go into schools and I talk to students about TikTok and TikTok brain, and how it's actually making it harder for students to be able to concentrate and have really directed attention because they're so used to just seeing so many. And it's true, you know, if you say go outside and they're like, it's boring. And so we've just kind of found ourselves in this place. And this is why I feel so strongly that what we do at Smart Families is we kind of share with families that it is possible and it is doable, and this is how we can do it. So wonderful. And I loved as well, I know you just touched on, for all age ranges of children or even adults, like it's not that one kind of demographic is more important, it's just across the board we should all be getting outside. Wonderful. So I wanted to start with a question and saying, you know, some people might say, oh, you know, well, I can watch nature on YouTube, or I watch relaxation videos of nature on a screen. So what is it that a child can experience solely being out in nature, being outdoors, that they don't get to experience when they're viewing the world through a screen?
Yeah, that's a really valid question. And I get asked that a lot as well, particularly when it comes to more of the artificial substitutions of nature exposure, like a sound machine that plays birds or rain or waves. Do you still get something from that similar to about a VR headset or a different kind of screen? It's tricky, right? Like our body does respond to a certain degree to some of that artificial exposure. And I think for when we think about people with different abilities being able to access nature, families that, depending on the neighborhood that they live in, some of those artificial stuff is okay, but the real deal is where we're getting engagement for all five senses, like Sally said, and the nearsightedness in the vision is called myopia. And that's becoming a really big conversation with younger kids that just have screens just right here, right up to their faces. The sense of, pivoting a little bit, but a sense of space and place in the world. So when we're outside, being able to, where am I right now? What do I see? What's going on around me? And like activating that observation, noticing part of your brain that can only happen when you have downtime and when you have, quote unquote boredom, because then that's when your curiosity starts to spark and you start to get interested and look around you and what's that tiny bug, or, oh, look at that beautiful cloud, and things just start to change when we look up, from our devices. I'm trying to think of other things: balance, agility, fine motor skills, layers of sound and hearing. It's just not replicated with the VR headset in that way. And then also, one more thing I want to say. Sorry, Sally, for interrupting.
That's okay.
What we're avoiding too with screens and viewing nature on screens is that you're still getting blue light into your body and into your system, and that can disrupt your sleep cycles, your children's sleep cycles, or their circadian rhythms. They're not getting vitamin D. They're not getting movement or activity. When we are on screens, we are very still. That response that you were talking about, Sally, of just like they're locked in. And so the sedentariness of what it means to view nature on a screen as well. So it's really, we want to be outside, more green time.
Yes. And I had shared with Sarah, as a teacher, one of my most favorite things ever to get to witness was seeing a child discover something outside that they would never have had the same experience if they'd been watching on a screen. So those of us in Houston know it doesn't often, rarely snows here. And I remember being in the classroom the day that the little snow sprinkle started, and we went outside and the children were just screaming with joy and opening their mouths, trying to catch the snowflakes, feeling it on their cheeks, feeling it on their hands, screaming they were going to make a snowman. I mean, it was like a sprinkle, like a tiny sprinkle. However, they were just so happy and excited. And I would often have moments I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. I'm so privileged to get to watch these children discover the world, because it was just so fascinating for them to see this change in the weather. I remember another time when I had students in my class who were playing with magnetiles, and then one of them had just kind of moved a magnetile and realized it stuck. They'd only ever played with the magnetiles, and they realized that the magnetile would stick to the chair leg because of it was a magnet, and they were like, wow, blew their minds. And so it's okay, well, let's go and see what else we can find that it might be being magnetic with. And just being able to see that, and that's the part and the thing that I fear that we will lose if we don't give these children the opportunities to go outside. And it can feel really hard sometimes. And a word that we've often discussed kind of in our office is, it's getting harder for people for it to feel more convenient to go to the park, or to go and sit in the front yard while your children are playing outside. And I really challenge parents to just be aware of what their children are not able to experience if we don't put ourselves outside too. And half the time when you're outside, you're actually surprising yourself, oh gosh, this is actually quite nice. I'm enjoying sitting here and feeling the sun on my face. I mean, maybe not with the humidity, but definitely because I'm one of those people that will complain about my hair in the humidity. But I think just putting ourselves out of our comfort zone and really, because I think when parents get to see those kind of amazing aha moments, or these discovery moments when children see something, or find that worm, or anything, I just think it's so special to watch. And I don't want it to be that it happens less and less. I really want to promote that as best we can. So And I know, Sarah, you're going to go into this more with your presentation now. Sarah has some slides. So Sarah's going to share her screen. Like I said, feel free, please use the chat or, raise your hand or share if you have anything you wanted to jump in, and we can ask Sarah while she's presenting. Over to you.
Thank you. Well, and Sally, I just want to touch on one thing that you said about the convenience of it all. And I think another phrase, because I'm an educator, so I try to distill things down to catchy phrases, but one is connection over convenience. And nature, like how we said, if we get dirty, oh no, and then we have to go wash our hands, and then that's a time thing. And so I think kids sort of absorb that a little bit as well, and they know that they shouldn't be dirty, and so then they don't like being dirty, and then it starts this whole thing. And so yeah, as we talk today, and I'm going to get my slides ready, I think the thing is again, connection over convenience.
Yeah, and having about I am, also very aware of things like germs and, however, I do really feel it's the balance. We kind of be so off balance, and we need to bring a bit of balance back. So
yeah,
okay.
And it's not a free for all, right? We can choose days where we need a little bit more convenience, but there can be free days where we explore, where we get dirty, where we allow those really organic, pun intended, experiences to happen. And so it doesn't always have to be all or nothing when it comes to doing some of this as well. That's something that I want to make clear too. Can you see my screen, Sally? I just want to double
We can.
check.
Yeah.
Okay.
We can see your screen.
Yay. Okay. So thank you so much, everybody. Let's kind of dive in and get into more facts as we go. These are some images from Unsplash. I'm sure it's familiar with a lot of you. The closeness of the screens, the interest in the screens, the age range of the screens, and then in the center, just this conversation that's really getting louder and louder, especially in the last handful of years, of what it means to spend time in nature, the deficit that certain kids are having with nature exposure now, and these ripple effects that are being created that we really won't even see the results of for years to come. And so the call to action today is more about, first, just acceptance of where we're at. We know that screens are saturated in our lives. They're not going anywhere. And so then what we can do is we can shift to awareness of what balance looks like and what boundaries look like and how we want to choose to interact with nature, choose to interact with screens rather than mindlessly interacting with screens or not with any intention. And so, yeah, this kind of just sums up. So yeah, we want acceptance of the problem or of the situation. We want awareness of the situation, and then that leads to action. And that's what we're going to talk about today. And it's my goal for y'all to be able to have a lot of resources and new ways to think about how you access nature, how you think about nature, how you perceive what it means to spend time in nature. Because when that starts to open up, we can start to create more opportunities for the kiddos to be able to get outside. And so this is speaking of nearsightedness and vision, another Unsplash image, but the screens have a hold on all of us, but especially with kids. We do have, this sort of evolving relationship with nature. I mentioned at the beginning, the last 30, 40 years or so, the screens are here to stay. And so when we prioritize screen time, we do get into that screen shuffle that I talked about of we go from TV to iPad to phone to something else. That speaks to attention spans, but it also speaks to just how engaging or how the screens can just sort of draw us in without us even realizing it, like a moth to a flame, practically, sort of like this kid with this iPad. We also start to think about spending time in nature as more of a luxury than a necessity. And so we'll save up outdoor experiences for vacations or for trips, and overlook the daily small doses of nature exposure that really is the most impactful for our brains and for our bodies of all ages, but especially kids. That increased indoor living, and certainly with Texas, y'all, we are about to get real hot. And so we have this unique challenge of where we live, of walking that line of, we know we need to be outside, but how can we do it safely? How can we do it in a way where kids aren't uncomfortable and then they're getting fussy or just they're frustrated because they don't like it either. So kind of thinking about that piece of it. Safety is obviously a massive priority, and certainly something else called your social determinants of health. And one of those determinants is the safety of your neighborhood. Do you have a green space in walking distance? Do you have a neighborhood that's safe to go for a walk? Some of those things, if they aren't in place, that can add to our reluctance or our resistance to spending time in nature. Weather connotations is another thing. I just mentioned it's going to be real hot in Texas. But even on rainy days, we tend to stay inside, but I think like the outdoor educator in me, I want us to go outside and splash in the puddles and see all the snails coming out to slide around on the grass after it rains, and what happens to the world around us when it rains, after it rains, rather than staying in and sheltered. We can go out and explore. And then with the social media piece, and I noticed this really after the COVID pandemic started, we were getting outside a little bit more. We were posting about it online. So we were going for a hike and then we were sharing it on Facebook or Instagram. And you can sort of get this sense of this nature with that when I do it, it has to be this beautiful hike to a gorgeous, perfect waterfall and a lovely picnic, and our expectations of what spending time in nature is versus the reality of what spending time in nature is. Sometimes there's a gap there. And that also contributes to our evolving relationship with nature. And so as we think about what it means to spend time in nature, another thing from a behavior change perspective, and that's some of the work that I do. I'm a board certified health and wellness coach here in Austin with my private practice. And what I do is I work with behavior change. So people that want to work with new habits, new behaviors, and we are weaving them into the complexity of their existing life. It's really hard to just say, here, follow this plan for how you spend time in nature. And if it's not customized to you, it can feel a little bit either tone deaf or it's just not quite landing the right way because it doesn't accurately reflect your exact circumstances. And so when it comes to nature exposure, we also want to think about the concept of biophobia. So biophobia is a fear or a dislike of nature. I would also argue it's a disinterest with nature. As I mentioned at the beginning, nature is boring to some people with shorter attention spans. And so there's a lot of reasons why we can be biophobic or have some nervousness around spending time in nature. As a teaching analogy, I love using the iceberg of what the behavior that we see at the top and then what's lurking under the surface. There's a lot of reasons why we might not feel comfortable in nature. It may be a sensory thing of bugs or getting dirty or grass touching your legs and then your legs get itchy. You might feel that it's boring, those weather connotations that I said earlier. Kids that are maybe a little bit more anxious or have an exaggerated startle response might not do well with unfamiliar noises or textures, those safety concerns, etc. And too many unknowns too. If we don't have the confidence or the knowledge about spending time in nature, it can just feel intimidating or overwhelming. And so we avoid it altogether. But some things to keep in mind on the left side of the screen as you think about growing into what it means to spend time in nature or green time, we want to establish what's called a growth mindset. This is a behavior change term. A growth mindset sounds like, I didn't have fun last time, but let me try it again. Let me go to a different park. Let me try a different activity and see how that goes. Just because I had a bad experience on a walk once doesn't mean it's always going to be like that. And so again, opening your mind up to the possibility of what good could come from the experience versus fear or hesitation. Another concept that I like to talk about when it comes to establishing new behaviors and habits is that it's not going to happen overnight, and there will be reroutes and detours, just like on a GPS system that you're asking for directions, but you will always end up at your destination. And so that mindset of we set out to go for a walk, it ended up raining, we got rerouted, but then we saw a beautiful rainbow, some snails, and looked at worms on the sidewalk. That's a reroute. That's a reframe of what we thought was going to happen to what we made it to be, and it still ended up working fine. And so having that mindset of it might not be convenient, it might not be according to plan, but we will still go out, we will have the experience, and then we'll come back in. Trial and learning is another one that I'm really fond of rather than trial and error. We always learn something from our experiences, good, bad, or otherwise. So again, keeping that in mind, especially when it comes to spending time in nature. There are external elements like the safety piece, the weather piece, the nature around you, what you have access to, the safety of it all. So keeping that in mind, of course, when it comes to biophobia. And then also keeping in mind the concept of we can be prepared for circumstances and events, but we can't control everything. And so if you're a nervous parent and you're wanting it to go really well, check in with yourself as well on what do I need to feel good and to have my kids in this situation and have them feel good? How can we be prepared knowing that I can't control everything because we are in a natural environment and things are not sterile like a playground. So keeping that in mind. And then also the concept of a risk versus a hazard. This is something that I learned at a training a couple of years ago at the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center in Austin, Texas. And it has to do with identifying areas in nature where kids can play. And so to use, for example, jumping off of a rock that's maybe a foot tall. Is there a risk that the kid might get hurt jumping off of that rock and landing on the ground? Yes. Is there a hazard that they're going to die or break a leg or have a serious injury? Likely not. And so when we start to think about spending time in nature in those two ways, it's either a risk or a hazard, we can start to identify where as parents and caregivers we need to be there and be close, ask them what their plan is, but still allow them that freedom and flexibility and strength to be able to play. Because jumping off that rock, from the rock to the ground, they're going to work their muscles, they're going to work their balance, they're going to establish self-efficacy and confidence. And if we're too scared to let them play, we're diminishing some of those nature effects as well. So again, really thinking about things in the concept of, is it a risk or is it a hazard? And then let's look at what we call dose response. And so this is, as we go into the summer, just in general living, how much nature do I need, do my kids need to start to feel these effects? I have two examples for how we look at this. If you're a visual learner, we've got the nature pyramid on the left-hand side of the screen, where you can see the daily doses of nature, the necessity, not the luxury, every single day in your neighborhood. So making it convenient, making it close by, making it so that you're really creating a relationship with the nature around you in your neighborhood. And that develops a sense of connection and fondness for the area and curiosity and wonder. And then as we go up the pyramid, we can see the frequency and then the location. And so as it goes up and up and up, it gets a little bit further out. And then let's peek at the chart on the right-hand side. And this is a little bit more of the day-to-day of what we'll be working with going forward after today. So ideally, we're looking for 20 minutes a day, 6 days a week, about 120 minutes a week of spending time in nature. And this can be, again, in the neighborhood, in the backyard. Nearby nature on this chart is basically the nature that's around immediately where you live, the things that you have closest access to. Your wild home is a similar concept, but you're creating an emotional connection with that nature space. It might be a little pocket of the backyard, it might be the front bush, but it's somewhere where there's a little bit of wonder, there's a little bit of emotional safety, and kids can really relax and start to develop an emotional relationship with their wild home. I'm a huge fan of the noticing window, especially in Texas. A noticing window is essentially just choosing a window in your home that has a view of nature and setting up a little chair or a little bench or something nearby so that you can just take a break and look out the window and see what you notice. There might be birds, there might be squirrels, it might be raining. That's a really lovely space and place orientation on hot days, on days where maybe the weather isn't fully agreeable with your plans. We can still connect with nature visually, sensory level, attention span things by leaning into a noticing window, particularly on the hottest days of the summer coming up. And then biophilic design is more seeking out nature in infrastructure and architecture. So particularly if you live in the city, and you don't have green spaces all around you, we can still look for trees, we can look for flower pots, we can look for weeds growing in sidewalk cracks. All of those things count when it comes to spending time in nature. And then as we go up the chart, we can see, 5 hours a month in a semi-wild location. Like I said, I'm in Austin, and I really like the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center as an example of a semi-wild location, because it still feels like you're out in nature, but there are groomed trails, there are restrooms, we can wash our hands, we can get a snack, some of those things, and it really helps with the biophobia angle of feeling uncomfortable in nature, particularly just out in the wild or out, without any resources. And then at the top of the chart, we've got that 3 days a year in a little bit more of a wild setting. Probably not so much for kids, but if anyone on the call has camping trips or travels planned this summer, make a point to notice what's different about the nature that you're going to as well, and traveling and comparing that to Texas. So that's dose response right there. And then, from the emotional intelligence perspective, getting kids curious about nature, I think, is the entry point to this new habit. Interest is something I've been reading about a lot. And when kids are interested in something, they have more excitement about it and they want to pay attention more. And so what I think a little bit of what is happening is they're not interested in nature. And so they don't want to give it the time of day because there hasn't been anything that's been appealing to them yet. And so this curiosity, this interest, we really have to kind of thread that needle in an interesting way, because when we spend time in nature, it leads to a sense of awe. The science of awe is a really interesting conversation happening in behavior change and in nature right now. But when we experience awe, whether it be the snowflakes that Sally mentioned of, snowing in Texas, which is a rare thing, the solar eclipse that we just had maybe a month and a half ago, those are all moments of awe where we're able to feel smaller, more connected with the world. We just take a moment to think about what's happening around us, and what that does to our brains is just fantastic. It just opens up all the neurons and everything gets going. Curiosity and interest in nature can also lead to bravery, exploration, courage. What's around this corner? Let's lift up this rock. Let's see what's underneath it. What's over there? What's under here? Why is this green and why is this red? And so just sort of facilitating some of those thought processes can be really helpful. The observing, the noticing how things work, that's another curiosity piece. I think too, back to the emotional intelligence piece, the sense of empathy, compassion for others, and also self-compassion and patience, all of that comes from spending time in nature, seeing how long it takes for nature to do its job. If you have an herb garden this summer, if you're growing any veggies this summer, that's a fun activity for kids, especially radishes, because they grow really, really fast. As for an instant gratification attention span thing. But to see, like, we planted these seeds and look how long it's taking for things to happen. It doesn't just happen overnight. It doesn't just happen when you click on the next video. It doesn't work like that. And so kind of connecting kids with the pace of nature, the pace of life, reestablishing attention spans through curiosity. Fascination is another thing at the top where, hard fascination would be an example of, oh, look at that red cardinal over there. Look at that red bird, and staring at that bird and having that attention locked in where you're fascinated by a very specific thing. That's hard fascination. Soft fascination is taking in the view of the yard, of the trees, of the clouds, and that's more of a massage for the brain. It relaxes the body. So fascination is a really cool thing that can happen even if you're not trying when you spend time in nature. So that's a cool thing. Mindfulness can come from spending time in nature. Earthfulness is a new concept I'm working on with a nonprofit over in the Netherlands, just to connect the concept of being present outside in nature. So kind of thinking about that. And then we talked about interest as well. This picture, I really love this picture. I took it at a camp that I facilitated at the Wildflower Center. And this was probably, I think, a 10-year-old kiddo that we were doing some journaling. And I looked down and I saw he wrote, "I love this place," and my heart melted, and I just snapped a picture really quick to be able to share with y'all. But when we give kids breathing room to spend time in nature, I think it really can flourish and it can change things. So again, with the emotions, I love this place. What did nature do for me? Helping kids connect the dots with their emotions using the feelings wheel, either from Texas Rising Star for little kids, older kids that have a larger vocabulary. You can start to identify exactly how you feel. And from an emotional health perspective, when we can describe how we feel more understood, and people understand us better. And so that's a communication skill that we can get. But if you were to, hypothetically use this almost as a before and after, like, how do you feel before you spend time outside? Let's check in. How do you feel after we spent time outside? Did anything change with your emotions? So another way to tap into what happens under the surface in our bodies and brains. So let's get into how we can spend time outside in Texas in the summer. These are some of my teacher hacks for safety, of course, but also comfort in spending time outside in the summer. The big three is shade, water, and ice, y'all. So shade, of course, seeking out shade from trees, using yoga mats or little square mats over the head as an umbrella, hats, of course. We've all got water bottles now, so I know that's not a concern at all. But we can use the water bottle as a teaching tool to talk about, what does it mean when you get dehydrated? What does that feel like? Does your tongue get dry? Does your head start to hurt? Do you get a little bit grumpy? Connecting the health layers and the self-care layers with the hydration piece, with time in nature. It's like lessons on lessons on lessons. We can take slow motion sips of water, feel the water go down our throat. That's a mindfulness moment, but it's also a way to stay cool in nature. I will talk about ice because it's my favorite thing, and that's the asterisk of this star right here. And the note is, bring extra ice cubes. They will drop it on the ground. They will want to put it in their mouths. They will ask for more. Always bring more ice than you think that you need. But when we use ice or a cold towel across the back of the neck, you are activating pulse points and nervous system stuff in your body that helps you to cool off your body very, very quickly when you are outside. I was teaching camps at the Wildflower Center in a heat advisory in July and in June, I think last summer it was, and we really had to be careful. And then we found out that leaning into the ice was a really positive thing. So you play around with ice cubes on your pulse points, so on your wrists, on your temples, on the back of your neck where your spine is. You can put the ice cubes on the back of the knees. And then something I like to call the armpit challenge, which is putting an ice cube in your armpit. Who's brave enough to do that, or who feels brave to do the armpit challenge today? And when kids interact with ice and when they learn how to cool their bodies down with ice cubes in the summer, y'all, the energy shift is instant. They become more comfortable. They become more curious, more agreeable, a little bit more open to spending a little bit more time outside because they've lowered their body temperature and they can function, they can think, they can not feel so fussy. And so I really, really advocate for ice or using like a reusable bandana that you can get cold and put it in the freezer, put it around your neck. It's just incredible how well it works and how simple it is as well. So stock up on ice for the summer. That's the big tip for Texas. And then also what I said about, the noticing window, nearby nature, how we can connect with the nature around us, sometimes without even going outside. You can do a nature log from indoors or outdoors. And all you're really doing is you're noticing what nature is like today. What's the date? What's the time? What does the weather look like? What kind of clouds are in the sky today? What does the weather feel like? If it's raining, what kind of rain is it? And it's just that space and place awareness that gets kids curious and interested. and away from the, head down and not even knowing that it's raining because they're so locked into their screens. This also is an exercise that helps to build connection, familiarity with nature. It becomes less scary, so we reduce that biophobia the more we interact with nature and notice it. We can do those emotion checks again. So again, I really encourage the nature log, not as a daily practice for your family. If you're up for it, go ahead and do that. But at least like a few times a week, just check in of what's the weather doing? What's going on? What new flowers are blooming this time of year that weren't before? What do we feel? Do we hear the cicadas now? Like there's just all these layers outside that we can access. And so other location access things, as far as like field trips or things that you do throughout the summer, we've got the noticing window, of course. That's the most convenient way to connect with nature. Then we move down with nearby nature, like the backyard, around the home, the park within walking distance, trees in the boulevard, that wild home, that emotional connection with nature as well. Grounding is a new, not new, but it's a buzzier thing lately in the last year or so. But grounding is just walking barefoot in the grass. There's just a new fancy name for it. Another emerging term is called touch grass, and that's more for the kids that are video gaming a lot. And it's almost like an insult that they'll tell each other, like, you're online too much, go outside and touch grass. So we're going to reclaim that, and everyone should touch grass this summer and get away from screens. Obviously, the parks and the community gardens are certainly a resource for green time as well. But I will argue, like in the photo that we're looking at, let's go to the greenhouse. Let's go to the plant nursery and walk around. It doesn't always have to be a hiking trail for there to be nature exposure and things to notice and look at. So I think look at your neighborhood, look at what's close to you. Where are the nature locations and maybe the different levels of nature locations that you have access to, so that you have a menu. And then on the day that you decide, like, hey, we're going to have a nature day today, where do we want to go? Let's pick a location from the menu, or here's what's convenient for us today. Green exercise is basically exercising outside without headphones, without any other distractions, and you're just exercising outside in nature. Going on walks in nature as well. They can be fast walks, they can be slow walks, and then certainly the arboretums and the preserves when it comes to accessing nature. So again, I just encourage y'all to think about other ways to spend time with nature that doesn't involve a big camping trip or this big luxury that we build up that we have to do. Just the slow drip of necessity is what we want to access this summer. Let's see. And then when we think about behavior change and experimenting, I use that word intentionally. We're experimenting with new behaviors. Not all of them are going to stick. I chose this image on purpose. Not all of these starter seeds are going to make it, and that's okay. But we're planting idea seeds. We're seeing what grows into fruition, what works well with us, and we can discard the attempts that maybe didn't pan out as well as we wanted them to. When it comes to nature, we want to consider what are the actions and the outcomes that I want from this experience. Am I trying to calm my kids down? Are they a little bit grumpy? What is kind of the prescription for the day of how we're wanting to do this, and then choosing the appropriate activity based on that. Sally mentioned free play and imagination play, thinking about the concept of stillness versus boredom, and kind of reframing that. Are we bored, or are we practicing being still and being quiet and watching? Some structured activities like the nature journal, like the ice cubes, those kinds of things are all good as well. Certainly with age considerations, there's a whole spectrum with that. So know your kiddos and know sort of like what's appropriate for them at that time. And then lastly, we want to establish not only the physical boundaries with the screen, but the emotional boundaries with the screen. And what by that I mean, there have been times where I've been teaching lessons with kids and we're out in nature and there's lots to do, but they only want to talk about Fortnite or Minecraft. And so how we kind of reestablish that emotional boundary with screens of, okay, so we're out in green time right now. We're not going to talk about stuff that's on screens. Let's be in nature, and having those gentle reminders of, yep, we're going to be outside. Let's not talk about things that happen on screens. Easier said than done, but considering that kind of emotional connection that kids have with screens as well, their comfort zone. Then, so something I want to highlight really quickly as an additional resource to the locations, to the age considerations that we've been talking about. We've also got a Green Time summer bucket list that Sally and I have been working on that we're going to be sending to families, of just ideas of how to interact with nature throughout the summer in free ways, in accessible ways. And then we've got some starter kits that we want to just suggest, right? Like as a resource for families in Texas. So these are from Inner North Outer Experiences, and that by Felicia, and she is near Austin, Texas. And she created these kits, and they're just wonderful. It's almost like not to use a technology term, but plug and play, like ready to go, everything that you would need. So if you're feeling like you need some extra tools to develop that interest, curiosity with nature, this would be a really great place to start. And then I've also got some resources on this screen as well. Texas Children in Nature is a fantastic, fantastic resource when it comes to activities outside, especially with our unique challenges of our climate. Olay Texas Outdoor Learning Environment is more for schools and teachers, but some really fantastic resources on risk and hazard awareness, preparedness and control, what it means to play outside with what's called loose parts, or just like pieces of like rocks and logs and things that kids can play with. Richard Louvre is a really good author. So yeah, those are my slides. So I'll stop sharing real quick.
Thank you so much, Sarah.
You're welcome.
It really is so interesting for me. And so for those of you on the webinar who aren't familiar with me, like my personal life, so I have a 13-year-old son, a 12-year-old son, and an 8-year-old daughter. And, you know, it's so, you know, overwhelming and scary as a parent sometimes to just see how much technology that they get immersed in actually takes them out of the development that that's intended for them. You know, one of the things that you mentioned then was you just made me think about my son. And my son, my 13-year-old, he really enjoys gaming, and he will play on Fortnite with his friends. And one of the things I started to notice was that he would often, like, you know, I wouldn't see him snacking or eating, and I was like, why is he not hungry? Like, and actually what happens with a lot of these games and on smartphones is the kind of apps and the games that they're playing on, they are intentionally designed to alter children's dopamine levels in their brains. And then what that subsequently means is, and just like the vestibular sense, which is, you know, the part that's to do with, you know, balance and movement, there's also the interoception sensory development. And that is basically when a child learns what their body is trying to get them to do. And so one of those things is hunger. And so children are finding it increasingly hard to recognize and interpret the signals that the body is sending them. And I think it was the part you said about, what does it feel like to be thirsty?
Yeah.
You know, we have to sadly model this and actually teach children these things, because they're not going outdoors as much. And so they're not instinctively learning, oh, like, I've got a headache. This maybe is that I'm dehydrated, because, you know, their bodies are just experiencing things in a totally different way. And so the interoceptive sensory kind of system, that's what is my body telling me? So, you know, walking in grass, like actually bringing their awareness to feeling something on their skin and then sharing with them, like that's sending a message to your brain, and you're feeling, you know, a certain way from that. I know you talked about the awe and wonder, and there's a lot of research how, you know, when somebody experiences awe, like it releases oxytocin in the brain. It, you know, it makes people feel like trust and bond, you know. So there are lots of things that happen. And so I just really encourage any parents on the call, like, it can sometimes feel a bit like, oh my gosh, what, we all need to go for a walk tonight after school.
Yeah.
And, you know, start small. Like my daughter in the car this morning said, why are there mushrooms everywhere? There's mushrooms in the gardens. And that's all it takes. And it's like, choose that moment. Yes. And go with it. Be like, hey, do you know what? That's a great question. When you get home from school, let's see how many mushrooms we can find. Are they in anybody else's yard? You know, why are they growing now? Why did we not see them? And just be aware of, we live in an amazing place where we have the migration of the hummingbirds. You know, just be aware and know what's going on around us, because sometimes we have to be the start of the interest for them. You know, we have to model that. We can't just assume that one day they're just going to be really interested in wildflowers. I mean, I would love to believe that their little brains, you know, will, but you know, even my 13-year-old, I have to model that to him so that he learns there is a world away from a screen, and that there's so much goodness that he can receive from being outside. So, but Sarah, thank you so much. That was amazing. And I know we've got links in the chat. Felicia's on the call with us, who created the nature packs. So I know she's put the link in there. We're also going to be doing this webinar again at 7 o'clock this evening. So if you have any friends and you're like, oh, I know people, even if they're not from our Smart Family schools, be like, I know people, like I've got mum friends, or, you know, I'm part of a group, a parent group, and we'd like to hear more about this. Please invite them. They can go to our website. They can RSVP. I think it's www.smart-families.org/events. They can find the RSVP in there, and then join us again. And so we will, yes, we're very grateful to have Sarah. I think what she shares is just so amazing, and it's great to hear the other parts, you know, across the country and the centres that you work for are all actively, you know, being very intentional at getting our children outdoors and teaching parents about why it's really important for us to model that for our children. So thank you. Any questions or any comments before we wrap up? We've done well. It's 10:02, so we're only a little tiny bit over, which is good for me.
Well, and while we wait to see if there's any questions coming in too, I do want to acknowledge, you know, sometimes it's easier said than done to spend time in nature. And so if there are families that have follow-up questions or they have very unique circumstances, I am happy to work with y'all to identify sort of some of what those nature opportunities are. That's some of the work that I do with nature prescriptions, but also with behavior change, with youth and family systems, because y'all are a system. And so we can't just have the kids outside, the parents have to be invested as well. And so, yeah, I just want to make that available, because it sometimes it can be a little bit hard to get a start, and then we get a boost and a push and we're off and running. So please, I welcome all questions and all follow-ups if you don't have a question in the call today.
Well, I can't see any questions, so I think we're good to wrap up. But thank you everyone for joining us on this first thing on a Monday morning. Like, set some good intentions for the week and think, you know, maybe just choose one thing you've heard today and try and implement that at some point this week, or maybe plan for something for next weekend. But thank you everyone for joining us. Happy Monday, and thank you, Sarah. We'll see you again later.
Okay, thanks y'all. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thanks everyone. Bye.
Bye.